We're interviewing Ronald Hudson of Colonial Heights, Virginia. The interviewer is Michael McGregor with the Grand Valley State University's Veterans Oral History Project. To begin, Ron, where and when were you born?
I was born in Three Rivers, Michigan on February 8th, 1950.
Okay. And what did your parents do?
My father was a commercial pilot, had been a bomber pilot in World War II, came home though to a family business. The family in that small town ran the pharmacy, and his brother ran the pharmacy and he ran the rest of the store. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, although I'm proud to say she was very pretty, I thought, from her pictures, and was in the Maid of Cotton parade because she was originally from Dallas, Texas.
Oh, okay.
And during World War II they met at Love Field, no pun intended. So they moved up though to Three Rivers, Michigan.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any siblings?
I did and do. My older sister Sherry and Ann Hudson, now Fluker, and my older brother C. Gilbert Hudson Jr. And they're 7 and 4 years older than myself, and fortunately they're in good health.
So you were the baby of the family?
I was the baby of the family.
And did you spend your childhood and teen years in Three Rivers?
Yes. No, actually, well, in that part, it was all in the same county, St. Joseph County, but my father's employment moved over to an adjacent community of Sturgis, Michigan. So I was educated and went through high school in Sturgis, Michigan.
Okay, what were you involved in any extracurricular activities in high school?
Yeah, I was a wrestler, and I'm proud that I got my varsity letter as a 9th grader. And I played football and baseball, and but in Michigan, baseball went into the summer after school was out. And so, although I had a lot of skill sets in baseball, to the chagrin of our baseball coach slash athletic director, I told him I was only going to wrestle and play football. And he said, you know, there might be scholarships for you for baseball. And he says, Ron, you're 5'7" and you're 170 pounds. So, but not taking good adult advice, I played football and wrestled until I got out of high school.
Now, what year did you graduate?
1969.
1969. And at this time, while you were in high school, what, if anything, did you know about the Vietnam conflict?
I knew a lot about it, and the reason I did is because my father followed it so closely. He was in the Air Force Reserve. I remember distinctly, I drew a sketch of an F-4 going after the PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, or what was reported at least to have occurred. And since he had it on the news, and nobody touched the TV set to any of the 3 channels that we had, you heard it even if you weren't terribly interested in it. But from being little, I was always, all the men in my neighborhood, every single one of them had served in some capacity in World War II or Korea. So I knew all of them and spent time with their kids and heard their stories. So I was very cognizant.
Did you expect to be drafted then, or?
Well, I didn't give much thought to it until, of course, I got closer to high school. My brother had graduated from Wayne State University in Detroit and was going to Detroit College of Law. And I knew I wasn't a very motivated student at that time. And but my father had arranged, and I had paid for me to get my pilot's license. And so I looked around and thought, well, if I'm not going to go to college, I will get drafted. Was there any place I could fly? Well, in all branches of the armed forces, you needed a college degree to be a pilot, with one exception, and that was the Army. So I actually enlisted for warrant officer flight school, and I then went to basic, and then I went to Fort Walters. But it appears to me now that the Army had planned for, from readings I've done, up to 700,000 being in Vietnam. Of course, they never achieved anywhere near that, but they had people in the pipeline to be pilots for those kind of numbers, and we just sat there and got no training whatsoever. And then ultimately they had us all take physicals again, flight physicals again, and they said I had had a perforated eardrum as a young man, but it had healed, and that high decibel sounds would deteriorate my hearing, and so consequently I wouldn't be able to fly, but I could pick any MOS that I wanted. And I thought I'd pick computers, and I did. It turned out to be the FADAC computer, which is the Field Artillery Digital Analytic Computer, the one used in FDCs. And all through my training, which I'll recount further, I kept wondering where the computer school was.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to backtrack just a little bit. When did you enlist?
I went in on the delayed entry program, so I enlisted, quite honestly, I don't recall. I would think it was probably February, March of '69.
And then you reported for duty?
August 20th of 1969.
And where did you go first? Did you go?
Went to Fort Polk. Alpha 3-1 was my basic training company, and I don't know what today's standards are. I didn't consider it grueling. I thought I had just come out of 4 years of sports, so, but there were people that apparently did, because it was aggressive, I think, because they knew everybody. Fort Polk was the primary departure point for infantry to Vietnam. It was where Tigerland was, the swamps were, and so even at basic training level, they really, I think it was a good basic training.
Now your training cadre, were many of them Vietnam veterans?
All of them, to the best of my knowledge, except for back then they had shake and bakes, or as you and I would call them, but people who had gone to NCO's academy. They had one or two of those as kind of like helpers, but the rest, in fact, one of them was, my drill sergeant had been with the 173rd Airborne Brigade and had seen extensive combat in 1965 and 66. And most of them had done at least one tour, and some of them more than one tour.
Did you find that their training was helpful to you?
I had nothing to compare it to, but I think probably the discipline, the team effort, weapons qualification probably more than anything else, although I qualified on the M14 and ended up with the M16. I made expert as a rifleman, and always liked to shoot. My dad had taught me to shoot, so yeah. In some sense, in the back of my head, I think it was part of at least what you start off with when you go into combat. That's really all you have to go by.
What was the makeup of your, if you can recall, of your basic training group?
I do actually. Demographically, it was everything from city kids to country boys to a little bit of everything. But there was a fairly large contingent in my basic training of National Guards that were going through basic training. And nice fellows all, but we both knew that our paths were going to separate rapidly upon completion of our basic training, and then when we went to AIT. So that was kind of a different, maybe not everybody had that experience. I know.
Was there, what kind of friction was there between the two groups then? We had one group knowing that, hey, I'm gonna do 4 or 6 months and I'm going back home, and the other group saying, I'm not going home, I'll probably be going to Vietnam.
Well, that may have existed, but because I had enlisted, and at that point still thought I was going to fly helicopters, I was where I intended to be.
Okay.
And apparently they all seemed very glad to be in the National Guard. So I didn't have any friction. Now, perhaps some others did, but nothing that materialized to my view.
Okay. So how long was basic training?
I think it was like counting going into the reception station and some other stuff. I think I was down there about 10 weeks, but I think basic training officially was 8 or 9 weeks.
Okay. So you finished basic, and did you get any leave, or did you go?
I got a delay en route. I was assigned to go to Fort Walters, Texas for primary helicopter training, and so I got a 13-day delay en route, and of course I delayed it right to Michigan, and I was engaged to my high school sweetheart, Linda, and the 13 days, of course, evaporated instantly, if you know what I mean, and that when you're home and you're in the military and you get any time at home, that time, it goes at an incredible rate, and the next thing you know, you're on a plane going back. And so I did get that leave, and then I went to Fort Walters, and I was at Fort Walters approximately 6 to 8 weeks in a status they called snowbird, because they had no ability to train that many incoming pilots who I think the Department of the Army knew they were never going to have to use. Some of that's hindsight, obviously, having read about it after the fact, but we just went through the kind of OCS kind of stuff that most people have gone through who went to OCS. It was a warrant officer candidate school, in addition to being learning to be a pilot, but never got our hands even into a training helicopter before they made this mass review of everybody that was there. And then after that, they really encouraged people to go to infantry officer basic course, and they said they'd even arrange for an abbreviated infantry officer basic course. And I contemplated what kind of infantry officer I would be, in as much as I was mad that I couldn't fly, and I didn't know how good an officer would be having an abbreviated officer's candidate school, so I chose not to go to that.
Okay, when you reported to Fort Walters, you were in the snowbird category. How many of you were there waiting for
Companies.
Okay.
There were multiple companies, or at least multiple large platoons. It was a large group of people who had stacked up like dominoes that didn't fall.
And did any of them, though, proceed with pilot training? Or?
I think a certain percentage of them did. If there was something they couldn't find, I'm considerably older now, and I've never had a physical, and I've paid for some pretty good physicals. I've never had a physical like that physical.
Okay. So they look for any reason to
color
wash
blindness,
to wash out, and
yeah.
so some of them did. So, what did the warrant officer candidate kind of training, albeit without the flying, what did that consist of?
Well, that part was a bit interesting, at least at the outset, when we didn't think we were just waiting, when we thought we were actually waiting to go into formal flight training, because we were on a day-to-day basis under, ostensively at least, the control of graduated warrant officer candidates who had not as yet received their warrant, but would do so soon, and they were like our TAC officers and or drill instructors, and they maybe they had instructions to see if they could make it tough. We had to pre-flight our uniforms the night before. There were silly little traditional games. If you had a string on your uniform and you hadn't spotted it, and they came up and said, "What is that?" You had to respond that that was a lanyard. A lanyard being a rope on a cannon, and he'd say, "I think you're a dud. If I pull it, will you go off?" And he'd say, "Sir, Cadet Hudson, I will go off, sir." And they would pull it, and you'd go, "Sir, Cadet Hudson, boom, sir." As silly as that sounds, it was one of a myriad of little traditional things that they did, trying to instill the same probably very similar type of discipline for people going into officer candidate school.
Okay. So that without any
Yeah,
flight
yeah.
training.
Right.
So then when you had that physical and found out that you were physically unqualified
to fly.
to fly, what happened with you then?
Well, I got to interview with a number of people, and it was like if you've ever bought a car nowadays, you go to one person. If you're a hard sale, they give you to another person. If you're a real hard sale, they give you to another person. And it was a real effort to say, "Look, you're the cream of the crop. Just because you can't fly doesn't mean we don't have a role for you. You've qualified, your OCT scores are great. We want you to," they really wanted people to switch over to infantry officer candidate school. And so there was a series of interviews in that regard. The end result was, if you just, as I did, said, I was angry, frankly. My attitude was, I wanted to be a pilot. I don't understand, if I'm enlisted to be a pilot. If I can't be a pilot, why can't I go home? Which was obviously naive for a 19-year-old, but that's what I was. And they said, well, it doesn't work that way. If you were qualified, that's fine, but otherwise, they sent me to a building, and there was one person in this little building, and it was nothing but 3x5 binders. And you got to remember, that's before computers. And they said, pick a MOS. I said, well, what do I do to do that? He says, well, they're all in those books. And it was row after row after row of 3-ring binders that were maybe 3 inches thick, and each one maybe had 10 MOSs that were related to each other. And so I looked around and I thought, well, if I can't fly, I ought to try to learn something really good. Computers is what's going on nowadays. And I was thinking also they're very large and may not make it to Vietnam. At that time they were as big as buildings. And I asked the person, who was very disinterested, I might ask, this librarian, enlisted NCO. There was this long list, and all they were numbers, the kind of numbers that are attributable to MOSs. and with very little descriptive information. I said, well, which one's, oh, they're all computers. So he says, which one you want? And finally, I just picked one. And it was 13 Echo. And 13 Echo 20 it relates to rank. And he says, okay, your orders will come down. So my orders came down, and I was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And 13 Echo was actually Field Artillery Operations and Intelligence Assistant. And at the get-go, I asked, well, where's the computers? They said, well, you get that at the end of the course. And I asked multiple times, they said, well, you get that at the end of the course. Meanwhile, we're learning how to do recons and learning how to calculate firing data, learning how to observe fire data, going out for fire exercises, lots of classroom instruction. They would do a calculation, the instructor would, and say, is that a check or hold, class? And if you thought he'd done it right, you said check, or if you thought he did it wrong, hold. And it was very mathematical, a bit geometric because it relates to angles and so on and so forth. Things that I always felt pretty comfortable with. And but I still hadn't seen those computers. And then at the very end, we got an orientation for 2 days on the Field Artillery Digital Analytic Computer, FADAC. It was about the size of a large stereo. And it stood about this high and was quite heavy. Came in a big plastic box with to protect it from being damaged. It had a generator that ran it, and it was, by today's standards, you could probably do the same thing with the most fundamental Texas Instrument hand calculator. But by those standards of that time, it was the hottest thing going. It duplicated the very work that we had just learned to do manually.
Now, how would you do that manually?
Well, you, without giving the whole course, you would determine the target location by plotting it on a vertical map. You determine the elevation. That was usually one person's job. Then, at the same time, there was a map on a table. That was called the horizontal map. And there was a large protractor, and that target was plotted there, and it was moved along, and that gave range off the protractor, and it gave the azimuth off the protractor, azimuth of fire, or the direction of fire in generically.
We called that deflection.
Well, it's azimuth until there's some adjustments done to it, and then it's deflection.
No, we always deflection.
Yeah, deflection. There's the circle was split into 6,400 mils, as opposed to 360 degrees, which most people would be familiar with. But you would call those out, and there was a recorder, a person who wrote the information down on a sheet of paper, a fire control sheet or mission sheet, and then certain other aspects were calculated with slide rules. And without getting too deep in the weeds, the slide rules actually had lines on them that you compared the information on the slide rule to a line based upon range or deflection, and but the lines changed based upon meteorological data that we got in periodically. So the meteorological data would allow us to redraw the line on a piece of mylar plastic that went on top of the we called them sticks, but they were slide rules of a type, and that allowed to adjust for various variables. There are a lot of variables, particularly to long-range artillery, that you have to take into account, even the wear of the tube, the different manufacturing lots of the artillery rounds, and I won't go into it anymore, but there's a lot of variables. So we calculated that, then there was a big book. And in that book, that gave us various adjustments to take it from elevation to quadrant elevation. And quadrant elevation adjusted for other variables that affected range and time of flight and so forth. So we could calculate all that manually, but this computer could do it as well. And from time to time, the computer was not operable. And we always would have races in our the group of people in the unit that did that was called the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. We would actually race the computer. And
Who would win?
We would win probably 3/4 of the time unless somebody made a goof, because it was an incredibly slow computer. And we wanted that capability because the generator could go out and the computer went down, and the computer could go out and that sort of thing.
Okay, so your FDC training at Fort Sill, how long did that last?
That was 8 weeks. Maybe a little longer as an assignment, because I got Christmas break in the midst of that. And probably one of the best military operations I ever saw was how they got everybody out of Fort Sill and either to the Kansas City airport or Love Field in Dallas, because they had things color coded, and all your flights were on rosters, and there were buses with color codes on them, and if you followed everything right, you got to your airport. And I thought when we got to the airport we'd be on our own, and now there were people with armbands on to direct you. Let me just see your paperwork and your ticket, and they marched us right up to the your specific airline. So I went home for a Christmas break, and it was snowy in Michigan, and one of the loveliest Christmases I can recall. Again, it flew by at an astronomical rate, and the next thing I knew was I went back to Fort Sill and graduated, and then after graduation I got another delay en route from Fort Sill to Oakland Army Terminal for my primary departure point for Vietnam.
So right after AIT, you did have orders for Vietnam?
I did, yes.
Okay. But you had some time. Did you have to do any RVN training at Fort Sill?
No, I know that they had Tigerland in, and I may have mentioned that in Louisiana, where I went through basic training. But at Fort Sill, I think the intensity of the training, I don't want to call it academic, but I guess it was in a sense. They had to focus almost all their attention on that. It was interesting, though, that there were 3 of us in my barracks that were the only people not going through artillery officer candidate school. And the only criteria was we had to keep our bunks just like they kept their bunks. And the rest of my class who were enlisted were in another barracks. So we would fall out at different times, and we would see the officer candidate school candidates going elsewhere. But they didn't give us a hard time because they knew we were enlisted and we were going right to Vietnam, and they were going off to artillery officer basic schools.
Okay, now let's ask you a question. Okay, you did make flight school because of some alleged, excuse me. number.
Oh.
I should just shut this off. I'm sorry, the tape will be edited.
No,
so
that's okay.
hopefully
No,
I'll be
that's
out of
not a
there.
problem.
But now you were disappointed not making flight school.
Right.
You thought you signed up for something for computers.
Yeah.
Now you got into the FDC training.
Yeah.
Did you become angry again, or at
No.
this point did you accept your fate?
I think at that point, first of all, I come from a military family. My father, his only brother, served in World War II. My dad flew the Berlin Airlift after World War II and was with the Ferrying Command during World War II. And prior to that, his father was one of the first registered pharmacists to be commissioned. Prior to that, in World War I, they were sergeants. And so there's a long, long history going to the Civil War. I accepted the fact that whatever had happened, and I was going to be in the military, and I was going to do my time, and I wasn't going to do anything that didn't fit with the type of service that my family had performed.
So just to recap, your AIT training is about 2 months. You learn to do all the functions manually, and at the end they said, well, the computer, you've just learned manually what the computer is going to do automatically. God bless you, good luck. And, so what was your reaction at the end of AIT that you got orders for Vietnam?
Frankly, the word was that unless you had a brother in Vietnam, that nobody was going to go anyplace other than Vietnam. So amongst the enlisted people going through that training. So it wasn't like any grand shock. We presumed all through training that we were going to go to Vietnam.
How many enlisted were in your FDC AIT?
I was in a platoon, and there was probably 30, and there were other platoons, even other companies. That they trained a lot of people for a lot of artillery units there. So.
Not companies, batteries.
Batteries,
You got
excuse me.
gigged.
Yeah, I did. That must have come from my subsequent service in different capacities, but batteries.
I want to backtrack. When you were trying to select where you're going to go after flight school didn't work out, you said they were really pushing infantry officer OCS.
Right.
Did they also try to push artillery OCS on you?
No,
or
not necessarily. They, I know that they went so far as I met with a sergeant, staff sergeant. I then met and told him no, I didn't want to go to OCS. I went with a command sergeant major, and I said, Command Sergeant Major, I don't want to go to OCS. I met with a lieutenant colonel, and he tried to explain to me the tremendous opportunity this was. Now in retrospect, many years later, I wondered if they really were under pressure to try to get a lot of people to go, and a lot of people did. They filled a theater with the people that had that physical and not passed it.
Wow. Okay, so now you got your orders for Vietnam. You expected to go to Vietnam.
Yes.
Did you know where you were going from your orders, or did you know you're just going as a replacement?
The best I could ascertain from the orders was from Oakland to U Service, Vietnam, and landing in Benoit, going to Long Binh, and I didn't even know that much as far as where they were. But and then that was the ultimate repo depot or replacement depot, and they just manifested people to all over the country.
So how long did you have between getting your orders and having to report in Oakland?
Less than 2 weeks.
Okay. And at Fort Sill, after you graduated, you didn't have any specific training for Vietnam as such?
Nothing more than all of the training during basic training was associated with, because again, most people were going to go in the infantry that were at Fort Polk, was associated with Vietnam. Increased your 2 canteens, not just one, and classes on malaria and so on. But there was no special Tigerland or anything for us. I think it was because our AIT was longer too than some of the 13 Bravo type AITs. So.
Okay, so now you got to Oakland. What was the process of getting overseas from Oakland?
You just flew commercially on a jet, and in my father's job, his corporate headquarters was in Los Angeles. He just happened to work out a business trip, and he actually flew with me to San Francisco, and seems a long ways from Los Angeles, but in any event, he managed to get to the West Coast with me, and then he rented a car and he drove me right to the Oakland Army Terminal. And I can still see in my mind's eye him standing out next to the car after I got my duffel bag out and so on. And there was a gate, and when you went through that gate, there was no coming out of that gate. There was concertina wire on the fence and so forth, and he just couldn't really think of anything to say other than take care of yourself. He wasn't a man of a lot of words, but he I wasn't, I can think back now and know it was a very emotional thing for him. Of course, I'm a father and grandfather now. But at the time, I just got dropped off. You know, I needed to get in that building. So.
Okay, what was your mother's reaction to your going to Vietnam?
Well, my parents divorced early in my life, and I had contact with her, but she, I don't think, oh well, she became aware of it because when I was in, she was originally from Dallas, Texas. I met with her one time on a weekend pass, but I don't think she really understood it all, other than she knew it was a war.
Okay. So describe the flight over.
You know, it was just a very long flight. I may be confused, but because I've tried to look it up, I believe we landed in Hawaii. I know we landed in Hawaii. And I believe we landed on Wake Island. And then, because it gets confused with the flight back sometimes in my mind. But in any event, we may have landed in Japan because there were stewardesses, as they were called then, for part of the flight, but for the latter part of the flight, they were not on the aircraft. And I remember that the jet made for a commercial jet, made a very abrupt descent in landing. And probably the most vivid part of that trip I remember is when they opened the door to the airplane and you got anywhere near the door, the heat and the humidity just wafted in, and the smells and so forth, diesel fuel, and you knew you weren't in Kansas anymore.
I just want to backtrack just a little bit. I forgot, you indicated, I think it was at basic training, or you had to delay en route and you went home.
Mhm.
Your girlfriend, fiance?
Yes.
Were you still involved with her?
Oh.
You were in AIT, and what was, what was her reaction when you got your orders?
Well, I mean, she came of a farm family of 7 and had 4 brothers in the armed forces.
Oh, okay.
And a number of them in Vietnam and the Army and the Marines. So I'm sure she was worried. And we wrote, and I ran up quite a phone bill. And spent most of my money waiting in lines to
Collect calls.
collect calls. So.
Yeah, okay. Okay, now you got to Vietnam, and I know that was always traumatic when your first exposure to the climate and
Mm-hmm.
the ambience and the environment and everything else. So explain the process, what happened to you after you got off the plane then?
Well, we were put on vehicles pretty readily, buses with wire on the windows and so forth. And we were trucked from the airfield to Long Binh. There was it's not really a parade field, it's more like a parking lot, a gravel parking lot, and it had a number of telephone poles, but they were only like about 4 or 5 feet tall, and they had numbers on them, and they had you stand in formation there, and they told you the times that you had to come back for formation. And what they would have you do is, as soon as orders were cut and you were manifested to go some specific location, they would have you stand behind one of the numbered poles. And frankly, other than that, we were free to just wander around aimlessly at Bien Hoa. And it was at the time that the 1st Infantry Division were departing, and looks like they had just departed. And I buddied up with someone whose name and I don't recall and never saw him again. But we said, well, let's find us a rack somewhere, and then we'll see if there's anything to do. And went into a barracks, and field gear, canteens, web belts, suspenders, even radio mounts for PRC 25s, bayonets, helmets, clothing was literally knee deep in the barracks we went into to find a rack. And I never know this what I do know as a fact is that at the next formation they had a bunch of MCOs there, and they rounded up all of us that hadn't been tasked to go somewhere yet, and they had big cardboard boxes, and I was told by someone that the post commander was relieved, because when that division left there was just that degree of disorder. And then we had to put helmet liners in one box, steel pots in another box, and all the various accoutrements of war in various boxes, and clean out those barracks. So that was one of the tasks we had. But I actually stayed there some people got there in 2 days they were gone. And mine went to 3 and 4, and there were so many people there that every time we would go to the chow hall, they were out of chow. And we were living on snow cones from the Red Cross donut dollies that were located there. And finally, I got with the NCO, and I said, Sarge, would you do me a great favor and find somebody that can tell me if I'm going somewhere, where am I going, and can I just go? He said, well, the same thing had happened to him, and he had experience, and we didn't get much in the way of results, but the next day we were all rousted up early in the morning, and we stayed out in that gravel parking lot for quite some time as they read off a huge number of names, tenfold what had normally been done. And I was behind one of those poles, and they said, remember your number. Mine was 3, and they said, remember your number and stay with your group. And that same sergeant was in, and I felt very relieved he was in that same group. And he said, well, I'm going to find out where we're going, so all you guys follow me. So we kind of trooped behind him, and it was Dong Ha. And we kept saying, he wasn't even familiar with, where's Dong Ha? Because he was a replacement from in-country. He had been with a unit that the 1st Division that had pulled out, but he had to stay in Vietnam longer. And the guy says, well, see Saigon? And I thought, yeah, baby, that's good, you know. He says, now see the coastline? He says, now run your finger all the way up. You see all that part that's red? Don't worry about that. And then he pointed to a little spot just, you know, millimeters on the map from the demilitarized zone, and that was Dong Ha. We ultimately did get on a plane, and it took us to Dalat. And with no manifestation to go anywhere else, that staff sergeant was invaluable to us young guys, because he said, these guys have got to get Dong Ha, and they would find out what flights would go a little bit closer and a little bit closer. It took us 4 days to get up country.
Wow.
Just because we weren't the scheduled people on any flight. So it appeared to me that in addition to getting all that equipment cleared up, somebody had put the word out, whoever the new commander was at Long Binh, get all these people out of here, I can't even feed them.
Okay, so now you got to Dong Ha.
Mhm.
So what happened in Dong Ha?
Very briefly went to the 108th Group. 108th Artillery Group was the controlling element for the artillery in the 24th Corps, general support reinforcing. And they assigned me to the 1st Battalion, headquarters to headquarters company, 1st Battalion, 39th Field Artillery. I'm not even to this day certain exactly how many battalions they had. I think they had at least 3 that I know of. And then they also had the Dusters, which are air defense artillery, and other units. But in any event, I remember the guy telling me that there was a base that, he says, you're going to a battalion that's got a fire base so high up it stays in the clouds year round. And I thought the guy was just putting me on. And later in my tour, I ended up on that base.
Okay, when you got to your unit, what type of unit was it? I know it's field artillery, but
Right. I got on a small 3/4 ton truck with no more than 2 or 3 other people, and we were driven south through Quang Tri City, down QL1, which is the main national highway, and then we south of Quang Tri pulled off onto a dirt road that went back maybe a click or so, and that was LZ Nancy, and that was our battalion headquarters. I believe it was also the headquarters for the 1st Regiment, 1st Arvin Division. And when we got in there, it was not a terribly large installation. There was one really well-fortified artillery battery, which I found out was our B battery of my battalion. And I processed into the battalion, and they tasked me to go, each of the batteries had a rear element in the battalion headquarters. They tasked me to go there to be a clerk, just for a few days while the clerk was on R&R. And that was in response to "Can you type?" And so I initially was in headquarters company, assigned to A Battery's rear area unit, doing their battery clerk work for a few days.
Okay, and what did A battery consist of? What type of weapons did they have? And
Right. Well, I didn't know it at the time because they weren't there. Our service battery was there, but they had just transitioned from M109 self-propelled 155 howitzers to 8-inch guns and 175 millimeter howitzers of tracked. Most people looking at them would think it looked like a very odd tank. They were tracked vehicles.
self-propelled.
Self-propelled. There were 4 guns to a battery, which is less than, as you know, normal. Normally there's 6, but there's only 4 to a heavy battery. They had tracked vehicles to supply ammunition with an M548, and then the FDC had a tracked vehicle called the M577, which was a command vehicle, had a lot of antennas on it and so forth. So I found that out later, but after being there just a few days, on the 13th of April, our battalion headquarters was attacked at night by an element of sappers and it was mortared extensively, and it was at 2:30 in the morning. It was one of the scariest things of my life, and I grabbed the essentials. I had I couldn't even button my pants. If you recall, they had buttons. I couldn't button my pants because my hands were shaking so badly, but I got my rifle, I got my helmet, I got my flak jacket, I had my pants on, and I put my boots on with no socks. I didn't lace them. And I went out the door, and literally, just like in a movie, that hooch or plywood building with tin roof to it just went up. Probably a satchel charge, because there's an empty space underneath the buildings that the sappers were throwing around, but it was a bloody good enough explosion. It threw me probably 10 feet. And then I was dazed for a moment. I came to and was alive, so I put all my stuff on properly. And I had been told before, if we ever get hit, there was a specific bunker we were supposed to go to. And I ran to the bunker, and I can't really describe it. It was chaotic. There was firing behind us because people were spotting sappers inside the wire. I described a rush to the wire. I don't want to make that more than it was. It wasn't like some human wave attack, but I think what it was is an element of other sappers were trying to come in and got spotted when the illumination went up. We had a combat engineer platoon that had mortars, and they were getting illume up pretty good. And you could see them in the wire. It wasn't hundreds. It was just, you'd see them pop up, and they were in the concertina wire and the tanglefoot. And there was more firing to my left than in my immediate area. But I fired at those silhouettes because that's what they appeared to me. All I wanted them to do was stop coming.
And you were in your assigned bunker.
I actually took a position on the berm because several of the bunkers had been hit by RPGs. And it didn't, even in my vast inexperience, it didn't look like a good place to be in the bunker. So I've laid on the berm next to
Explain the berm. What was the berm?
Yeah, the berm is nothing more than if you took a bulldozer and you had 2 points and you just made a dirt, a bit of a wall, but actually just a mound of dirt in a lineal configuration. And we had bunkers that were made out of sandbags. and but they knew what they were doing because they spotted those bunkers, and I think they thought they had automatic weapons in them, and few of them did. But they hit the bunkers with RPGs, and then we were taking 82 millimeter mortars at the same time. And it went on till about 7 in the morning. At first break, it started to wind down. The explosions lessened. At one point, the rifle fire was such that you couldn't even discern individual shots being fired. It was just a roar. And then an officer came by in a quarter-ton Jeep and picked every third person from what I think he thought was all headquarters company, but actually was some service company and everything. But I was one of every third. I was the third from when he started counting. And he got about 12 of us perhaps. And headquarters company was a little distance, maybe 100 yards from where I was at, maybe 150 yards. And he got us on line, and we were supposed to sweep through the buildings in headquarters company because they felt there were sappers underneath some of those buildings. And that was one of the scariest things I ever did, because I envisioned hundreds of sappers with all having a bead on me in this 5-meter intervals between us as we went forward. And the first shot that fired, I jumped into what I thought was a ditch, and actually it was a ravine. And I must have gone 8 to 10 feet. The ground was real, it was not flat terrain. And I remember crawling out of that and then catching up with the line moving forward and limping, because it was a pretty long fall. But we engaged, or at least identified, 3 sappers, and 1 gave up, and 2 were dispatched by rifle fire.
Running out of tape.
Well, we finished that up. Most of us were assigned to do different tasks after that.
What kind of tasks were you assigned to do?
Well, I won't really go into it to any great extent, but there was a cargo net, and the NVA sampers, we had to put them in there, and that was a wake-up call for somebody that's 1920 and never seen anything like that before. And
now this experience happened, how long were you with your unit? You were obviously
I still really wasn't. I was waiting for my orders
okay.
To go from headquarters and headquarters company. That's why I have in my 201 file their award of the
okay.
Valorous Unit Citation, which we did get.
So you were really a new guy.
Yeah, and then they, as soon as Specialist Swan, I'll never forget his name, came back as battery clerk from his R&R, then and only then did I go to my firing battery. There was one, I need to interject, in the horror of war there's always something that, believe it or not, is humorous. Maybe because it's so opposite of the worst things. We were sitting near the helipad, and this big helicopter came in with the big blue, in fact, this insignia on the side of it. And that was 3-star General Zayas, the commander of 24th Corps. That's pretty high up. I mean, he talked directly to Abrams. And he wanted to see what had happened. And he landed in the door to the bunker where the battalion TOC was, opened up, and they all came out. And I thought they looked pretty snappy compared to the way most of the rest of us looked. And we were sitting down, and he just totally ignored them. He saluted them and said, and I don't know what he said, but he said, I really don't want to deal with you. And he walked directly over to about 6 of us sitting on the ground. I was near the battalion aid station because I needed some minor assistance with some cuts and things. And we all started, I mean, this is a general, you know, I mean, we were new guys, a lot of us, or some of us. We started getting up, and he said, no, just sit down. And he had just an incredible grin on his face, and he looked like central casting for a general. And he, General Zayas, asked us how it was, and some things I could hear, some things I couldn't hear. I had a lot of ringing in my ears. But he said, is there anything I can do for you? And we couldn't think what a general could do for a bunch of privates, you know, send me home. But no, we knew that wasn't in the cards. One guy spoke up and said, well, sir, we have seen a PX for months. Obviously, he had been there a long time. Months? How many months? And he said, well, I've only seen one, and I've been in the country 6 months. And that was coming here. And he said, I'll see what I can do. He left a couple hours later after going to the talk, and then about 4 to 6 hours later, well into the afternoon, CH-47, a big helicopter, a big cargo helicopter, landed, and on an area that typically wasn't a helipad, and they opened up the back of it and took out 55-gallon drums and spread a rope around it and put a cash register on one of the 55-gallon drums and brought out sodas, candy, all the typical stuff that would be in a small PX. And of course, people lined up real quick. And what cracked us all up was these guys had helmets with their chin straps on and their flak vests and everything in the greenest green uniforms you've ever seen. And I know I only had some money in my pocket that was all wadded up. My wallet had burned up in my building, which had been totally destroyed, including my MAC-V card, which stopped me from getting any money in country for about 2 months. And so I went up and I was trying to figure out how much this was, and he was keeping track on the adding machine. He says, I'll just take it, get out of here. And so I just took, he didn't make me pay for it, he just wanted me to get my stuff and get out of there. And I think they wanted to get out of there about as fast as they could, because there were craters in that, not every casualty had been policed up, and I don't think they were used to that environment. I don't know where they came from, but I know they were glad to get back to wherever they came from.
That's good. Okay, so how long did you stay there before you had to join your unit then?
Well, I think at the end of the month, I think altogether I was there maybe 2 weeks or so. Somewhere I'm thinking around the 28th of April, the clerk drove me to Camp Evans, which was further south down the same national highway, which runs along the coastline by and large. And I was amazed because Camp Evans was huge by comparison. I had seen nothing in northern South Vietnam that compared to the size of Camp Evans. It was more like Long Binh or Benoit or some of the big bases down south. And my battery was on the south west portion of the perimeter, where we could get still be in the perimeter and range on into the mountains with our howitzers or our guns at that time. And I was introduced to my section chief for the FDC, and I was told I had a number of us. Being the new guy, I had a number of assignments. They didn't have enough M16, so I was going to have the M79 grenade launcher, which, and a 45, which seemed like being unarmed in the environment I was in. But in any event, I was going to be the track driver for the M577, and they would teach me how to do that, and then I'd start off as a vertical chart operator and a horizontal chart operator and so on in the FDC, and they could basically were able to split it into two 12-hour shifts, so they could run 24/7. Oh, by the way, we have people that are assigned to that are from our battery but are assigned to be forward observers, and if they need an RTO, you're going to be it, because all of us have already done our stint doing that. And so I spent my time there was wholly different than what I'd experienced back at LZ Nancy at the battalion headquarters. It was a large facility. They had a post office, a little PX, and so on. Pulled my shifts, got comfortable with the FDC operation, the call signs and SOIs and all the various codes that we all had to learn, and cacking in secure communications and putting up 292 antennas and burning barrels, which you probably are familiar with, but we did all those things. We went on a number of raids. Raid sounds impressive, but for us, it was a way to take two guns and the FDC track and two ammo carriers, and which were loaded with ammunition, and cross the open plain. And people's vision of Vietnam as jungles. Well, this area was like just a flat open plain until you got to the ridge lines that you started getting into triple canopy jungle and so forth. We would run out past it really wasn't a fire base. It was called Firebase Jack, but it was actually just a place from which people would maneuver from. There was nobody stationed there, and we would move off in different directions depending upon LRP teams that were in the jungle and so on, in an effort to put our range fan further into the jungle than it normally would be from Camp Evans.
Well, what was the range of the 8-inch?
If memory serves, the 8-inch could do about, well, in miles, maybe like 10 miles. The 175 millimeter could do maybe 18. The 175 was notoriously inaccurate. I mean, you could hit a generalized target, but the 8-inch, you could really refine that down to even hitting a bunker. It was so accurate. But the 175, I think, because the variables were so extended because of its extremely long range, it you know, if you were trying to hit, say, a car, for instance, you could adjust and go on one side of the car, and you could adjust again and go on the other side of the car. So it was okay to harass the Ho Chi Minh Trail with, but wasn't good in support of infantry. And then, but I also, in addition to raids, going out in different directions from Firebase Jack to the jungle line, tree line, I got tasked, and I went out with Lieutenant Drennan and he taught me to be a forward observer. And RTOs aren't typically forward observers, or I guess in the scheme of things they weren't originally designed to be forward observers. They were supposed to just be radio operators for the forward observer. But he felt that everybody that was with his team, the recon sergeant if we had one, and RTO, needed all of us be able to do anything necessary. So we plotted targets, defensive targets, because again, while we were forward observers for 24th Corps artillery, we certainly took all of those missions. The forward observers, the direct support forward observer, they would swap off missions between the two of them. So we would help them in adjusting not just our own batteries, but other batteries. So I did that for a while, and then we got the word in May that at some point we were going to be going up to Firebase Ripcord. And Ripcord seemed foreboding to us, because when we plotted it on the map, it was on the map in that big green area, dark green area. It was a airborne fire base, like so many fire bases, only usable by bringing helicopters in by helicopter, or bringing howitzers in by helicopter. And ours, of course, couldn't be lifted by a helicopter. So the idea that they were going to cut a road that far deep into the jungle, and we were going to go down that road, was a imposing thought for all of us, because we thought that while we had 50 caliber machine guns mounted on a lot of our vehicles, what an imposing, wonderful target, and noisy target would be tracked vehicles following a bulldozer, two bulldozers actually, as the combat engineers cut the way, switchbacks, all the way to Firebase Ripcord. And Firebase Ripcord was about, I would guess, 5 miles from Ripcord. Well, it was obvious why they wanted us to be there. Ripcord needed all the support artillery it could get. It was using almost all of its direct support artillery, and not just its brigade direct support, but direct support from other brigades. It was using ARVN artillery. It was using my battalion's battery that was on another fire base called Barbara. And on Firebase Ripcord, then we could provide good direct support. We had all 4 8-inchers at that point. And that meant we got a lot of contact fire missions. And you could hear on the headset or over the speaker the crackle of rifle fire, the yelling, the sound of war for sure. And our guys picked up real quick that these were really important missions. Some missions we fired were called H&Is, harassment and interdiction, and you just felt like you were shooting at nothing. These, somebody really needed us to fire bad. And I'm proud of my battery, A battery. The guns were up instantaneously. If they had to be relayed, they were laid instantaneously. At least I think it was instantaneous. Humping 204.4 pound projectiles is no small task. There's no conveyor belt for those. You have to get them out of the bunker and put them on a tray, and 2 guys have to carry it, and that tray has to be hooked onto a hoist mechanism that lays it in the breech for the 8-incher. We had guys strong enough that they could carry one of them, carry them by themselves, balanced on their shoulder. And if you've got guys in contact, that's exactly what they did. We formed lines to get, I carried powder canisters because I'm not as strong as some of those guys were, but they were fusing next to the gun, and normally fusing was done some distance away. And we fired illumination, we fired ICM, which is little bomblets that come out, and we fired all serious missions from Rakkasan in support of Ripcord. It culminated throughout the whole siege, and we really had the feeling we were next. A weapons cache was found near our fire base. We took minor incoming because I think all the assets of the North Vietnamese Army were focused on the hills around Ripcord and Ripcord itself. But if they wanted to get to the lowlands, if that was the objective of the North Vietnamese Army before the monsoon season, it seemed to us like as soon as they got through with Ripcord, we could see the beach from, it was a long way off, but we could see it from our elevation. And we thought that was where we were going to, and when we couldn't be lifted off, you know, it was, guys were sharpening bayonets, and we improved our position, and it was a new position for us too. We had to bury it the whole time we were there because they had made these prefabricated bunkers and just set them into depressions. Well, those depressions had to be covered by sandbags, and we would fill ammo canisters with dirt. And I never did so much shoveling in my entire life.
How many rounds would the battery shoot, say, in a typical 24-hour period?
Well, it's not like direct support artillery because, for example, we didn't have 175s with us, but I just happen to remember the maximum number of rounds you can fire through a 175 tube until you have to take it off the gun and change the barrel is 1,100. So I think that for 8 inchers it was something like 4,000 rounds till you had to be retubed. That's why we were a precision weapon. The biggest problem we had was getting observers that weren't comfortable with 8-inch rounds trying to adjust on a bunker from 1,000 meters. They thought that was danger close, and that's a long ways.
Well, what was the bursting radius of
well, it would vaporize anything within 200
meters? Yeah, okay.
And so we weren't minimizing that, but golly, if you're going to adjust on a bunker, you can't probably even see a bunker at 1,000 meters.
Mm-hmm.
So we went out and kind of went with some FOs and showed how a bunker could be destroyed. If there's any frustration on my part for the Battle of Ripcord was that they didn't use us more. We certainly shot a lot. We shot a lot of 51 cal positions that because they were shooting at all our helicopters. So counter battery, which were mostly mortars, we would fire on them. You know, you could get a direct hit. We got a lot of secondary explosions. But the problem would be is that if anybody was left with that mortar, they picked that mortar up and drug it over 500 meters and set it up again. It's hard to kill the mortar itself.
Yeah.
So, but the thing I recall distinctly was when the pullout took place from Ripcord, excuse me. I was functioning as the section chief. I was now one of the older, more experienced people, and a lot of we had a lot of people had come in and kind of en masse, and they lost them en masse to DEROS out of the country. That's when you go home when your tour is over, and the word came down that we were going to adjust from Rakkasan a TOT mission, and a TOT is time on target, and it is where you mass the fires of lots of artillery from various units with the intention of having it all hit at one time. So the units have to fire at varying different times because some are closer, some are further away, some are firing high in the air, some are firing lower. But the intent is to get them and to surprise the enemy and have them all hit at one time. One of my jobs as the section chief and the chief recorder of the fire mission was to get the initials approval, and we really were focused on that because there was one set of initials we had to get, which meant that everybody was clear off from Ripcord. You don't want to fire if there's any of our people still there. And there was pauses at that we kept wondering, well, are they off or aren't they off? Because we heard other radio traffic that led us to believe that everybody was off, but I think there was maybe an Arvin soldier that had been left there in reading later on.
Yeah.
But we finally, the thing that impressed me is on the paper that I wrote on, which was called a record of fire, I had to write the call sign and the time of flight for each of the units that were going to fire in that TOT. And I filled that whole front of an 8.5 by 11 with units. And I had never seen, nor did I ever see subsequent to that, a TOT that had that many different firing batteries, that had anywhere from 4 to 6 howitzers all firing this TOT at one time. And when we got the final clearance, we called down through all the lists and got a combo check with all the units and gave a countdown and then said Tango Oscar Tango. And that meant they were free then to fire at their at the appropriate time based upon their time of flight.
Mm-hmm.
And that had been communicated. They knew their time of flight, so they knew the Tango Oscar Tango time. So they had worked backwards to when they had to fire, but that released them to fire. And then I was disappointed because I had to stay in the FTC to keep things going, but I let my horizontal chart operator and my vertical chart operator go up the steps. I said, don't leave the doorway. And
You just watch it?
they got to watch it, and it was something to behold. According to them, I had them come down and cover the radio, and then I ran up real quick, and of course I didn't see the actual hit, but it was, that whole hill was just engulfed, and then there were some late rounds hitting from probably guns that got a round stuck in the tube or whatever.
Was it just a battery one, or was it?
No, I think they continued. If memory serves, they continued. But they, I actually talked to Colonel Spalding. Is it Spalding?
Yeah,
Yeah. I talked to him, and he was a captain in an S3. And at the time, he said, "Well, what they did is they broke it up into like 3 groups. We fired the whole TOT at one time from everybody." But then after that, we continued firing, but so that one group could resupply and rest, they fired another group of maybe a half a dozen batteries, and then another group, and they kind of split it up. What they were waiting for is the B-52s from probably Guam, I would guess, were an hour or 2 out, and we kept firing until they gave us into mission. And I wasn't there. I think that would be a question for Colonel Spalding, but he said that there were about 2 battalions on or near of NVA on or near that hill, closing on that through the wire when our TOT hit. So I think we did what they wanted us to do. And I don't remember my battery's movement back to Camp Evans because I went on R&R at that point.
Now, where did you go in R&R?
Went to Hawaii. I had gone through a months and months of written communication, because that's the only way we had to communicate back home. And I'd asked my fiance if she would meet me in Hawaii, and she came from a good Baptist farm family, and she says, "I love you to death, I would come, but my parents say I can't because we're not married." And the idea was we would get married when I'd return. And well, I thought that was at least in some doubt. I said, well, if you're willing to, I'll marry you in Hawaii. And she said, I mean, they didn't have a lot of money. There wasn't going to be a huge wedding. There weren't going to be limousines when we came home anyhow. Hawaii maybe sounded a little more exotic than what she would have gotten in the way of a wedding, other than not having her family there. And they gave her a big shower at home, and she did all the paperwork with the state of Hawaii, sent me a form I had to get signed by a medical officer in Vietnam, which was no small task to hunt down. And we landed in Hawaii and got married.
Great.
And again, it was a very quick week. It wasn't even a week, it was 5 days, I think. And then I went back for 6 more months. She went back to dental hygiene college. And she always comments that we didn't have a fight the first 6 months we were married. And because I was in Vietnam, I always comment to her to speak for herself. That I had a number of them after that, because we went up after that. My unit went to the DMZ. There was Lam Song 719, which was the invasion of Laos by the Arvans, and lots of incoming. But we operated from that point on up there.
I would like to stop this right now.
Begin.
I think we talked about the TOT, and while that wasn't our last exact mission, things started to wind down, and the battery was tasked to make the road march from Rakkasan back to Camp Evans. I don't remember the road march at all, and I think the reason I don't remember the road march is because I was tasked, I guess that's not true. I was supposed to go on R&R.
Okay.
And well, I remember one date because I got married on the 15th day of September, but I don't remember when I left my unit to go to make my way down to Da Nang and that sort of thing. So I think if memory serves, I got flown back to Camp Evans to go to our rear area in order to go on to Hawaii for R&R.
Okay, and you got married in Hawaii on R&R then?
We did. I offered my wife, then my high school sweetheart, I offered her the opportunity of a much better honeymoon on a limited budget than probably the wedding would have been pretty nominal at best. We were always going to get married when I got back. And I think that her big compromise, of course, she would have loved to add her family there, but she was amenable to that suggestion, and we were married at the Fort Sill Army Chapel, and in
Right on Waikiki Beach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, we went back for our 25th wedding anniversary, and the only building remaining of Fort Sill is in fact the Army Chapel, and according to the chaplain, that was slated to be torn down, but the many thousands of people from Korea through Vietnam that got married there put up such a fit that they didn't go through with that, and they had actually remodeled it. And on the day that we walked over there the morning after we got there on our 25th wedding anniversary. They had just cut the ribbon on the rededication of the building.
Oh, great.
And so that was an interesting experience.
Okay, so how long were you on R&R then?
Well, I think all R&Rs are about a week. I'm trying to remember. I guess it was 6 days and a wake up or something like that. And then my wife got there a day ahead of time, and hooked up with some other ladies waiting for their husbands, and in fact, I think humorous at the time was we met at the R&R Center at Fort DeRussy, which was just a open cafeteria-like building, and it had yellow lines that the dependents were supposed to be on either side. And when we came through the door from the bus, people would get snatched left and right by their families. And I made 3 passes down up and down that aisle, and I didn't see my 5-foot wife anywhere. I thought that when the taller people cleared out, I would, but I still didn't see her, and she didn't see me. And the reason for that is I weighed 170 pounds. I'm 5'7" when I went to Vietnam. By that time, I probably weighed 152 pounds, and I had a very, very dark tan, and I had grown a mustache. And I'd written her about the mustache because I thought that might be an issue, so I told her about that. And she was going to a school to be a registered dental hygienist, which was very similar, I understand, to a nursing school. It was a 2-year, year-round school. And they had to have their hair off their collar, so her long blonde hair that went down her back, she had cut it off into a kind of a bob short haircut, and in preparation for her wedding pictures, she had lost, not that she needed to, but she had lost about 10 or 12 pounds. So the reality was that neither one of us recognized each other.
Wow. Okay, so now you get married on R&R. Then how much time had you had in service before, in country, before you got?
Almost
got the
exactly
R&R?
6 months,
Okay.
almost to the T. And then when I got back, my battery had also displaced from Camp Evans, and we had gone to Camp J.J. Carroll. J.J. Carroll is in the far western part of Quang Tri Province. Off the National Highway north and south is QL1, that's QL9, and it's just a couple of clicks south of the demilitarized zone. And we were there in support of operations of the 1st of the 5th Mechanized Infantry, and also the 1st ARVN Division. And so we maneuvered out of Camp Carroll, engaged in artillery duels with the heavy North Vietnamese artillery. They had 155 artillery on the other side of the DMZ. So we had counter battery fire. We had missions west to try to shoot into the A Shau and shoot into the Ho Chi Minh Trail as it entered South Vietnam, and most of the fire bases along the DMZ had alphanumeric designators. There was Alpha 2, Alpha 4, Charlie 1, Charlie 2. Some of them had names like the Rock Pile and KGO Bridge, but we would take 2 guns of our 4, and we would go for varying times to support other guns that were in those various positions from the 108th Artillery Group, which is part of the 24th Corps, which was my parent organization.
Did you have to split FDC too, or did you rely on their FDC?
No, we would take our M577 track vehicle, and we had an FDC section, which was usually one of our two shifts. We kind of always split the FDC into two shifts, 12 hours, but many times it demanded overlaps of countless hours, sometimes that everybody was up 24 hours, but in those instances, one shift would take it and go on one raid, as they like to call them, and then on the next shift, the next raid, they would take the track and go out onto it. And we calculated the firing data from those specific locations, just as if we had been based there. And I think one disturbing thing is in order to fire a fire mission, you have to get initials from people and write them down on a piece of paper called a record of fire. That document memorializes that fire mission. And the various initials would be perhaps the observer, it might be a unit commander, and then it might be other people. But one clearance, and I never knew who those initials were, was called political clearance. It meant that presumably perhaps an advisor to the South Vietnamese in some capacity, some operations center they had, would approve us to be able to fire the fire mission. It was a bone of real contention and real frustration that we would be fired at from across the DMZ, have people get out on the guns, work up the data to fire back, counter battery fire, wait for an excruciating period of time, and then on occasion just get negative clearance to fire. And it was always the political clearance initial that we would not get.
So generally, how long did the clearance take if
Well,
you did get it?
normally you probably have three initials that you would get over the radio. The observer and perhaps the person who was the commander on the ground or his subordinate would sign off instantaneously. So it was the one political one that we got by virtue of our higher headquarters monitoring our fire frequencies, and we would check in with them and say standing by for initials. And then sometimes we would be on hold for 15, 20 minutes. Well, the reality of that is that probably what you're shooting at, unless they were in a fixed position, had moved. And then furthermore, we were taking incoming, and people were getting hurt, and yet somebody couldn't decide that it was okay to shoot back. And I'm quite old now compared to what I was then, and to this day I don't understand how that could have happened. And I read a great deal about the war, and still haven't run across anything where anybody's given me any insight into why we wouldn't get clearance. I could understand it if there was a special operation going on and there were troops that they didn't want us to inadvertently fire at, but these were on the other side of the Ben-Hai River, the demilitarized zone, and it happened with some frequency, I guess, without trying to quantify it.
No, to backtrack, did you have to have this clearance when you were supporting Ripcord?
Yeah, exactly, but it was purely, no political clearance. It was just
Okay.
the FO give you initials, and that was more to make sure they understood, and we verified, because we knew from call signs and initials who was who, and
You just needed somebody to give
to
you clearance
validate.
to make sure that there's no
Yeah, you weren't going to hit
troops in
friendly
the area,
troops.
yeah.
There was no political aspect to that.
Okay, so you didn't have
whatsoever.
that, so then
No.
that became, the political aspect came into play when you went up to Camp Carroll?
Yes, well, that was my first experience
Okay.
with it, yeah. When we went to Camp Carroll and to the various fire bases on the DMZ.
Okay. So did you spend the rest of your tour on the DMZ?
Yes, by and large, support of Lam-Song 719, which was the South Vietnamese Army's invasion into Laos.
Where did you set up for that, or were you doing
Well,
it from Camp Carroll?
No, well, we could, because we were at that time that we had changed from an 8-inch battery to two 8-inch guns and two 175 millimeter guns, which have roughly twice the range of the 8-inch guns. Not nearly as accurate, but twice the range. And we would take those guns, still staying at Camp Carroll, but we would go up. There was a large presence of American forces. Even they reopened the old Quezon combat base, or some portion of it, and we would get closer by virtue, for range purposes, by virtue of movement west along the QL9 highway that wove its way all the way into Laos. In fact, there's an old French fort that's right there on the border. And so we would maneuver in that area, generally with mechanized elements of the 1st to the 5th Mechanized Infantry.
And who would set up security when you set up firing positions?
Well, particularly when we were doing just a 2-gun raid, we were always with, we generally would have, I guess, I'm not as familiar with the mechanized infantry, but I would guess the number of tracks that we had were never less than 2 of their APCs. And I suppose it was something like the equivalent of a platoon, but that would be the minimum that we would have. And if we got into an area where there was other artillery, we would just hook up with them and whatever their source of support was.
How long did the raids usually last?
They could, we did raids that we would go out as soon as the roads were open, and come back before it got dark. On the other hand, we would go out for 5 days. So it was whatever the tasking and the mission tasking was to engage those targets. And of course, to someone like myself, who at that time wasn't in the field with the infantry any longer, but was with the Fire Direction Center, they were targets. And other than the fact that I could identify the location on a map, I really didn't have any real sensing as to how significant the targets were. They were either suspect enemy locations, logistics areas, particularly in Laos, enemy in the open, but the observer would call for, sometime would call for a battery and adjustment, which is, for artillery people, is unique, particularly for our size artillery, because you normally would adjust with one gun, and then when you were on target, then you would fire for effect with a battery. So they, these were aerial observers, generally Americans in helicopters, because if I'm not mistaken, no Americans were allowed to be on the ground with the South Vietnamese once they went into Laos. But all the helicopter support and the aerial artillery observers were all in helicopters. So.
Okay. After how long did you have to serve after Lam-Song ended?
The dates get a little fuzzy, but we probably another 8 weeks. We went from Camp Carroll to our battalion headquarters, which was LZ Nancy, which was the very base I had started my tour at. And then we were there not that long a period of time. We had another battery on a fire base called Firebase Barbara. It had been stranded on the top of that fire base for a year or longer. They had cut a road as they did for Rakkasan, but what happens with those roads, and they really, road is a misnomer, they're swaths of jungle cleared by a bulldozer, is the monsoon rains would wash them away, and then after a year, you'd be hard pressed to even find where it used to be. So what they would do is they would have everybody in the battery up on Firebase Barbara, which was, I don't recall its exact elevation above sea level, but it was over 800 meters. So it was a really tall hill, and it was constantly, even before the monsoons, in the cloud cover. But it was a very good launching pad to then shoot from there into the Ashaw Valley. But what they did is they would just have everybody assemble with their personal equipment and their personal weapons, and have the two batteries leave all the what the military would call TO&E equipment, the howitzers, and everything in place, and just swap people and logbooks
Okay.
and that's all they could do, because that there was no way to get that battery off that hill without a major operation. That was in fact the fire base that I de-roased or exited Vietnam from, being flown off in March of 1971.
March of 71, okay. And where did you leave country at? Did you fly out of
No,
Penang or Cameron Bay? Or?
No, we went, yes, we went to Cameron Bay, and that's where I finally departed for the States, and we took flew to Japan, and then if memory serves me, we flew to Hawaii, and then to Oakland, California, and or San Francisco, and then we were bused to the Oakland Army Terminal, and that's where I was processed out of the Army.
So you when you got back from Vietnam, you were released from active duty?
Yes, they had a provision that if you had less than 6 months left, and if you would, so I extended my stay a little bit in order to make sure that I had the 6 months, less than 6 months. I wanted to get home. I wanted to get to my wife that had only been married for 6 months, and she always jokes that for the 6 first months we were married, we never had a fight. And I always correct her and say, well, perhaps you didn't, but I had a number of them.
Yeah, you didn't have fights together.
Yeah, we had fights together.
Yeah. Okay. And then briefly, when you got back, what did you do?
Well, I went to college.
Just about 10 minutes.
Yeah, went to college on the GI Bill, and got a degree in public finance and public administration from Ferris State University College then. I went to, we had to relocate to Virginia because the economy was not good then at that time. I worked in local government and I worked in banking, and then I switched, as soon as the opportunity presented itself, I went back into the Guard and Reserve. I served and I was commissioned as a second lieutenant, a very old second lieutenant, a almost 31-year-old second lieutenant, and I served for 27 years, active, guard, and reserve, and commanded a firing battery during Desert Storm, and that was called active duty. And we got as far as Fort Bragg when the 100-hour war concluded itself, but that was no disappointment to my wife. Some of my young men in my battery were disappointed. I told them, well, perhaps we didn't know the extent of the war because we've been isolated. We hadn't seen any news. So I told them that might have been fortunate for them that's as far as we got. But I had a lot of Vietnam veterans that were my senior NCOs in that National Guard unit.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate your story, and it's a heck of a